Few people had ever actually met Clara, as Slade kept her carefully cloistered within his house at Gramercy Park. And those who had, mainly elderly men like himself, come to discuss weighty matters of business over dinner, were frankly unable to say much about the girl, other than that she was tiny, pretty, in a rather Semitic way, dark and all eyes with an air of melancholy, and had a positive genius for vanishing silently at the tread of strangers' feet and the sound of strangers' voices. Slade's reasons for taking her in, therefore, remained a mystery. All that was definitely known was that he and the girl's father, one Reuben Adler, had had financial dealings, and that in the summer of '89 they had met at Adler's home on the South Jersey shore to discuss business away from the stupefying city heat. There he had been introduced to Clara. 3 months later, shortly after her 15th birthday, Clara had moved permanently into Slade's home. Perhaps it was felt that the young Miss Adler would benefit from being in the great metropolis, where she could regularly attend the opera, ballet, concerts, and the theater, and where she would have the opportunity to meet people from a wide spectrum of acceptable society. Perhaps Slade, who should have known better, neglected to tell both the girl and her family the brutal fact that her ancestry would bar her from the company of that acceptable society, regardless of the identity of her sponsor. Or perhaps he did tell her, at some later date, for society was never once disturbed by having to refuse the discreetly dropped suggestion that Slade's ward desired an invitation to tea or wished to pay a call. Instead, Clara had spent the 4 years with Slade in nearly total seclusion, and her appearances at the ballet or opera were memorable simply because they were so rare. Like Halley's Comet, vast stretches of time seemed to pass between her being seen. Unlike that heavenly apparition, however, Clara's appearances followed no fixed schedule. It was their very unpredictability, in fact, and her forever downcast eyes, and the way she would cling to Slade's arm as if terrified of being swept away and drowned in the glittering crowds, that caused the performances on the stage to be all but forgotten in the endless whispered speculation about her. Out of sight, out of mind, however, has become a proverb precisely because it is true. During those long stretches in which Slade's box at the Opera House sat empty, New York turned its collective mind to other, more immediate, if less exotic, matters, and the mystery of Miss Adler and her reasons for being where she was lay dormant. Until that terrible night in February of 1894. According to the information gleaned from the servants, Miss Adler had been awakened, in the small hours of the morning, by cries from the dying Slade's room. She had rushed across the passageway and arrived just in time to see his eyes glaze over. Her screams had awakened the rest of the household, and a footman had been dispatched to summon the doctor. One horror had followed another. The worst blizzard of a bad winter had delayed the doctor, and when he finally arrived, breathless and soaking wet, Slade had already been dead for close to an hour. There was nothing to be done for the deceased but to close his eyes, fold his arms, and pull the sheet up over his face. The girl, however, hadn't left the dead man's side since entering his room, but had sat holding his hand in her own. That hand had been warm when she had taken it. By the time the doctor pried it from her frantic fingers, it was growing cold and beginning to stiffen. The combined strength of the doctor and the girl's maid were needed to get her back to her own room. She had fought them wildly in her efforts to stay with her guardian, seemingly unwilling or unable to believe that he was truly dead. Even after they forced her to lie down and a sedative had been administered, she continued to cry. What had been most terrible, however, and a sure sign that her mind had become unbalanced, were the fits of laughter that had alternated with her tears. The doctor, being a prudent man, had stayed with her until she fell asleep, and had kept her heavily sedated for the next few days. He had also refused to allow her to attend the funeral. Thus was New York cheated of seeing, up close and